Welcome to the EcoParent Podcast Network. I'm Sam, the founder of EcoParent magazine. My partner Alexis and I had zero experience in the publishing industry, no money, and a new baby. But we quit our jobs, leapt into the unknown, and started EcoParent magazine anyway. It was absolutely freaking terrifying. But at the same time, it felt right. Just a few years into the journey, Alexis was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer that later found its way to her brain. It was utter chaos, navigating treatment schedules, caring for a 3-year-old, and trying to run a fledgling business, not to mention the general emotional havoc. Alexis didn't make it, but the rest of us did, and I've spent the years since raising a wonderful son and building EcoParent into North America's top print magazine for conscientious families. Even 10 years in, we're still a very small crew. If you send an email, it's probably me that will answer you. And this podcast network is a monumental step for us, another leap into the unknown. But like before, it just feels right. And I know that Alexis would agree that the podcasting team I've assembled here is an incredible group of people whose only goal is to inspire the best in you. If you like what you hear in this podcast, or the other podcasts in the network, please consider supporting our efforts through a contribution to our crowdfunding campaign, live now on Indiegogo. The link is in the episode notes. We've got some stellar perks lined up, and I personally guarantee that every dollar raised will go toward the creation of more episodes. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and let you listen to the podcast. Thank you so much for stopping by. You're the reason we do what we do.
The Feeding Families podcast is all about nutrition for kids. We bring you new ideas and inspiration for your kitchen and answers to your food questions so you can overcome the very real, very frustrating food-related challenges so many parents are trying to figure out. I'm your host, Jess Sherman, family wellness educator, author, practitioner of functional and holistic nutrition, and mother. I want you to develop unwavering confidence in the choices you make every day, so let's get into Feeding Families. Hello, welcome back, families. Thank you so much for tuning into the Feeding Families podcast. I'm your host, Jess Sherman, and I have a guest with me today. His name is Dr. Kirk Gair. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gair.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am so excited for this conversation. I'll introduce you in just a sec, but just to frame out a conversation, I invited Dr. Gair to come and talk about concussions and brain resilience because it was a few years ago now, I started to get really interested in the idea that nutrition can prevent severe concussion and prevent some of the issues with concussion and also help in recovery because as a nutritionist, I was really interested in that. And as a mom of 3 avid hockey players, I was also really interested in that. And then Dr. Gair crossed my path and he is quite an expert when it comes to both sports nutrition and concussion specifically. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Gair. I'll just read a little bit about you and then we'll get into it, okay?
Sure. Sounds good.
So Dr. Kirk Gair graduated with honors from Southern California University of Health Sciences in 1999. In addition to his chiropractic training, he is also trained in functional medicine and neurology. And he now combines all of that with something I'm finding very interesting as I learn about it, low-level non-thermal laser therapies.
You've got one right here. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so excited for you to tell us more about that because you've really been pioneering this for, 2 decades.
Almost 18 years. Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. And Dr. Gair has treated Super Bowl athletes, World Series champions, gold medalists, world record holders, state and national champions. You seem to be quite a hub for athletes.
Yeah, right.
And has published papers on laser therapy. You train doctors internationally and is currently the principal investigator in a new type of laser therapy. He practices in Pasadena, California, and you can find him at laserchiropractic.net. And we'll put all of your links for contacts here on our show notes. So this is just so exciting because, I'm a busy mom and I'm a concerned mom, and I know a thing or two about nutrition, but I don't know very much about concussion. So why don't you start with what got you interested in helping kids, especially with brain issues like concussions?
Well, what got me really interested in it is my personal history with having ADHD and being an athlete. And I also had Tourette's as a kid. So I went through a time period where I had tics of, motor tics like blinking, grunting, whistling, even involuntary muscle things. So trying to learn how to control those ones and playing 11 years of football and having multiple concussions, and particularly playing football in the 1970s and 1980s, back in times where nobody knew anything about nutrition at all. I thought I was eating healthy if I went to Kentucky Fried Chicken because it was chicken. And I had, if I had that and I had their wedge cut potatoes, it's potatoes and chicken. So I had all these concussions. And back in the day when I played, if you had a concussion, you were sent back into the game, especially if you're one of the main athletes on the team. And so we'd get these repeated concussions over and over again. And I noticed as an adult, particularly in my 30s, that I was starting to suffer some of the long-term effects of it. And when you have a history of, say, ADHD and you add concussions on top of it, it really creates a lot of difficulty in trying to be organized, trying to be successful as a doctor or as a business person, et cetera. And that's what got me interested in, was learning how to try to help myself, because I was going through some of those things. You hear people talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, where people who had multiple concussions have this progressive type of deterioration in their brain function. And I was going through that. I was losing motivation. I was angry a lot, but I'd hold it in. I was getting to the point where it was very hard for me to even feel happiness anymore. And it was affecting all aspects of my life. And so that's what led me to the nutritional approaches and the laser approaches to try to help myself. And then in helping myself and seeing the tremendous change that it did for me, to where now in my 50s, my brain works better than it ever did in my life, I was excited to bring this to all the kids, to try to spare them from what I had gone through. And what I remember just being a kid sitting in class and having trouble focusing and being extremely disorganized. And so I was thinking, well, how can I help today's generation of kids? Back in my 20s, I thought it was with being a teacher. I used to teach middle school and high school and adult school, but then I realized that wasn't the direction exactly for me. And so that's what got me interested in it, was first to help myself and then to help kids, to save them from what I experienced as an adult.
That's so interesting because I was a teacher as well. And I thought, well, I want to help kids. So I'm going to be a teacher, right? And then I think both of us share this history of like something else, but there's something else. There's another
Yeah,
piece
right.
of this, right? Like how to help kids learn and help kids function. And I went the nutrition path. You went the more neurology path.
Yeah.
But I want to pull out a couple of things that you said. One was that the long-term effect of concussion, like concussion is turning out to be a very big deal. And here in Canada, we have a law called Rowan's Law. I think it was back in 2013, where a rugby player died of this. It wasn't of the concussion itself, it was of a post-traumatic injury, post-concussion.
Mm.
And her family really wanted to raise awareness for concussion in sport. Since you started, there's a little bit more awareness, at least, that
Hmm.
concussions are a big deal. So I just wanted to pull that out, that you mentioned the big deal is not necessarily at the time of the event. The big deal is later in life.
The long term. Exactly. And that's where we can really do some interventions to help people a lot, and both before the athlete gets the concussion with what we do nutritionally and supplementally with them. And then also once they get the concussion, nutritionally, supplementally with lasers, et cetera. And one of the problems is with these young kids is if they go to your average pediatrician, they're well-versed in infections and disease.
Mhm.
They're not at all well-versed usually in concussion, because no one was really trained in that. And particularly if they've been out in practice for a long time, their standard thing is going to say just, rest it, go to a quiet room and take ibuprofen and you'll be fine in a week or two.
Mhm.
And that's not always the case, particularly if you have a kid that's eating excitatory neurotoxins like aspartame and MSG, or if they're meal skipping or they're having tons of sugar. There's so many things we can do to help kids that are actually pretty simple for parents to do to avoid these things. And real quick story about that. I think it'd be good for the readers to understand.
Yeah, let's share that in just a second. But just to clarify, this is important for pre-concussion to make your brain a
Correct.
little bit more resilient should you have a concussion. And it's also important if you should have a concussion, it also becomes important. So this goes for, well, all kids, really. I mean, none of us should be eating these excitatory things, but particularly if you have kids in sport or you have very active kids, well, gosh, I can't even say that. It's for all kids.
It is.
Right?
It's for all kids, active or inactive, because an inactive kid could, get in a car accident or fall somewhere
Sure, fall off their bike.
or go to a water park and, have an impact that can now create this whole inflammatory sequela and cascade that occurs afterwards.
Is this more important for kids who are struggling with something like ADHD or struggling with a pre-existing inflammatory condition?
Yeah, it definitely is. And particularly, let's say if a kid has leaky gut, they're going to have leaky brain usually. And so if you have that, now you're going to get more problems going on there. So whatever they come to the table with already pre-existing and whatever genetic things they already have, like myself, where I had all these different kinds of things already pre-existing, you're going to have a different outcome. The example we had when I was taking my functional neurology training is they talked about you could line up 10 kids in a row, take a baseball bat, hit 10 of them with the same force in the same area of the brain. You'll have a couple of kids are like, oh, wow, that kind of hurts. And they're fine, no problems. You'll have a couple others, they'll have a concussion and have some problems for a few days. And you'll have some that it's going to be months and weeks. And you'll have others that their life is devastated just from that one impact.
Oh,
that
yeah.
is showing you the difference with what their nutritional status is, their genetic status too. And if they got, leaky gut, leaky brain.
Yeah. So I want to go into all those things so that we can know as parents what's our vulnerability here.
Sure.
And more importantly, I mean, I always want people to know what they can do, what you can
Yeah.
actually put into action to help our kids. Okay. So I'm going to stop interrupting you. Tell us your story that you wanted to share.
Okay, sure. Yeah. And it's funny because these are all really important too, because the focus has always been on just like helmets and how a helmet can protect. They forget all these other aspects here. If you remember in Star Wars, the Princess Leia hologram of "Help us, Obi-Wan, you're our only hope." I get a lot of patients in my office that are at that point to where they've gone through everything. They're at their wits' end and they end up in my office. I think she was 13 years old, this one patient, and she had gotten in a car accident and she had a mild concussion. Pediatrician said, oh, just rest, ice, ibuprofen, you'll be fine. So she does that and she goes back and she plays soccer about 2 weeks later. When she's playing soccer, she heads the ball. And as she heads the ball, she gets this, what we call a secondary impact, because her brain hadn't fully healed from the first one. And she gets a secondary impact. And now it creates this crazy cascade for her to where she became agoraphobic. She didn't want to talk to any of her friends. She wouldn't even text them. She would just stay in her room. Everything triggered anxiety. When she came into my office, she was just twitching like crazy and blinking, and she wouldn't really respond with words, was just like either shaking her head no or yes. And she had actually had a suicide attempt because of how her brain had changed. Her pediatrician now wanted to put her on Prozac and institutionalize her on a 30-day hold. So her mom was at her wit's end of what to do. We looked at her nutritionally. One of the things she did, like so many kids, is she was skipping meals like crazy. And even these athletes will do it. They won't eat breakfast. They won't eat lunch, which you can do intermittent fasting, which can be fine if it's done properly. But these kids don't intermittent fast. Like here in the United States, the most popular place for breakfast is Starbucks. And people go and get a latte and a muffin or something like that. So it's all sugar and processed things. So that's what she was doing when she would eat. It was going to be something sugary like Rock Stars and Monsters. And then she was eating things like Flamin' Hot Cheetos and Takis, which have monosodium glutamate in them. So she's constantly pumping her brain with sugars and excitatory neurotoxins, and that was just ramping everything up. And she didn't eat any good fats, didn't take any supplements at all, no magnesium, none of these things. So she was in really bad shape when she came in. So one of the things we did with her is we put her on a ketogenic diet, because we know from the work of, like, say, Dr. David Perlmutter, that can be really beneficial for the brain. We made sure she wasn't meal skipping so we could stabilize her blood sugar. One of the things I learned from Dr. Karazian in his functional medicine courses is that a sign that the blood sugar is off, and this is a great thing for the parents to notice, is if your kid gets hangry, like the Snickers commercials, where they get irritated and then they feel better when they eat, that's a sign they have some hypoglycemia going on. You should only feel that you're not hungry anymore when you eat. You shouldn't feel a mood change. So she was having that, and I explained to her mom that she's probably got some functional hypoglycemia. We need to make sure she snacked every 2 or 3 hours on something that's got good protein and good fats in it. And we did this. We supplemented her with DHA from fish oils. We did magnesium threonate with her. We had her taking scoops of coconut oil on a daily basis. And we used the low-level lasers on her as well. And what was great is we took this kid from being agoraphobic, suicidal, looking at a 30-day hold and on Prozac, to where a month later we knew she was better when she was sitting there and she had her cell phone at her side and she's texting her friend while she's talking to me and interrupting her mom. She's multitasking now, and her mom says, "Thank you so much for getting my little monster back." And that's what excites me about what I do, because I think, what if she hadn't come to someone like me who knows about nutrition, who knows about supplements, who knows about lasers, and what if she had gone on and gotten on Prozac and done the 30-day hold? I mean, her life would be totally different. That's the importance of what you can do with nutrition, supplementation, lasers, etc.
So a couple questions. When her mood started going downhill, was there a connection made between the head trauma and the mood? Because I think sometimes that's missed too.
Yeah, it's missed a lot. When I talked with the mom, that was the amazing thing, is I said, well, what did your pediatrician say? And I'm not saying this to knock any particular practitioners. It's just all of us weren't really trained in this stuff. So I had to learn this by paying tens of thousands of dollars to take extra training on there. The brain is only about 2% of our body weight, yet it chews up about 23 to 25% of our energy on a daily basis. When you have a concussion, the need for fuel is even greater. And if your fuel is not there, then you're not going to have proper mood. It's going to affect your neurotransmitters. Once you get a head trauma too, Dr. Karazian published a study that showed that within either 20 or 30 minutes, you start to lose gut integrity and you start to get a leaky gut. And a lot of your neurotransmitters are made in the gut too. So you get this whole, what we call bidirectional communication breakdown. And this is where you get a lot of problems with these kids having concussions, and it's missed majority of the time. And even the family members will a lot of times just tell them, oh, you just need to stop whining, stop being a baby. And it's unfortunate that people don't understand this is running everything. And if it's damaged, everything's going to have a problem.
Yeah, I get that a lot with the mood and behavior and the learning issues that I see as well. If the body is under stress, it needs a massive amount of nutrition to heal.
It does.
I really take that to heart, what you said about the brain. The brain is really hungry. It's really hungry. And your whole nervous system requires a lot of nutrition.
Yeah, it does. And there's such a breakdown where, if people have pets, if you go to a vet, what's one of the first things they ask you when you take the dog or cat or chicken or bird or whatever you have there? They're going to ask you, well, what are you feeding them? And if you're feeding them a crap diet, they're going to instantly say, oh, no, you got to put them on this high quality medical food diet. And people will do that. They'll drop a ton of money to feed their pets good food, but yet they'll go and take their kids to McDonald's or give them Cheetos or these soft drinks. And they completely have this disconnect between what they're putting into their body is affecting every system and particularly the brain.
Yeah. And these are foods that are very highly addictive too, right? So when your child tells you they will eat nothing but, right? We must go to McDonald's. I will eat nothing but that. They're saying that because it's an addiction. And
Right.
I always like to tell parents, all of your children's behaviors, they come from somewhere. They have a root issue. Something is going on. So if they will eat nothing but processed foods and McDonald's, then something is going on that's driving that. It's not just that they're trying to, pull one over on you or be stubborn, or that can be part of it. We just mentioned how your body needs a lot of fuel. But you mentioned 3 in particular, which was magnesium 3 and 8, DHA, and what was the third that you mentioned?
Well, I also have them using coconut oil. We also do things like resveratrol and turmeric as well, because you want to dampen the inflammatory response too. So we have a whole protocol that we have them do.
These are anti-inflammatory nutrients that you're giving them, right? And
Right.
your end goal is to help the body regulate its inflammation response?
Yeah, because that's one of the things that happens with so many things. When we look at inflammation affects virtually everything in our body, anything from, say, a concussion to cancer even. Or let's look at COVID right now. What are people dying of, really? A lot of times they die of that cytokine storm, which is an inflammatory storm with interleukin-6. And so if there are ways we can dampen inflammation, then we can kind of tame things down and stop the destruction that's happening. So one of the things I look at with these athletes is, in a perfect world, I'd have them run lab tests, but that's not always possible with people's budgets. So I will just make some assumptions. Hey, there's probably inflammation there because almost every person has it. So let's do some resveratrol and some turmeric. And then with magnesium, we can also help to tame that down. And we can also make sure that excess calcium is not triggering damage, because a lot of people don't understand that when it comes to calcium, it can be problematic with a head trauma because it can actually start to get released from the cells and start to damage mitochondria. And one way you can balance that out is with magnesium. So we'll have these patients take high levels of magnesium after their concussion to try to neutralize that.
Yeah, that's important because a lot of parents are always worried about calcium, right?
They always are.
They don't want to take their kid off dairy because of calcium, or, how is my child going to get their calcium? So I think that's really important to say, when you have a trauma like this, the body will release calcium in order to heal. And that needs to be balanced out with magnesium.
It needs to be balanced out, right? And that's where now we go into the prevention is let's have these athletes taking magnesium on a regular basis. And there's multiple different forms of it. It's real controversial which one's the best. Just one of the docs that I really admire and does a lot of research, he talks about using magnesium 3 and 8. It's a little more expensive, but it more easily crosses the blood-brain barrier. And if you can have kids take these preventatively and do things to neutralize inflammation preventively, like with turmeric and resveratrol, and a lot of people don't know about resveratrol for inflammation, but studies show if you take turmeric with resveratrol, they have a synergistic effect to do a better job of knocking down inflammation. So we have them do that both in the healing phase and also the prevention phase too.
Tell me if you agree with this, but at the beginning, I asked you whether it's more important for kids who have ADHD or some kind of inflammatory situation. And I think it's important to just pull that piece out, because all of those mood, behavior, oppositional defiance disorders, contact disorders, all of these, even learning issues, have been connected in some way, shape, or form with excess inflammation. So if you have that kind of child, I guess it's safe to say you're at increased risk for secondary problems resulting from concussion, because you already have a high level of inflammation.
Definitely. And then that just makes it worse, And then if you add in things like foods with MSG in it, then you also set it up. And if I can share that story with you too about MSG, that'd be great.
Hey parents, this episode of the Feeding Families podcast is being brought to you by the Canadian School of Natural Nutrition. Are you aspiring to start a career in holistic nutrition? Looking to achieve optimal health and well-being and help others do the same? CSNN's Natural Nutrition Diploma program can help you gain a well-rounded understanding of scientific, holistic, and practical applications of natural nutrition. Earn your diploma, professional designation, and title, and join the over 11,000 graduates worldwide. The comprehensive science-based curriculum provides a strong foundation for a career in the holistic nutrition industry. Learn how to create individualized health support programs for clients. With part-time and full-time schedules and flexible learning formats, including live online classes, there's something for everyone looking to improve their overall health and well-being with holistic nutrition. There are multiple CSNN branches across Canada, plus online distance education options. Learn more at csnn.ca/holistic-family or follow the links in the show notes. So just to sort of recap, we've covered some of the things your body needs in order to regulate inflammation, whether there's trauma or not. But now let's get into what should we not be eating because of inflammation.
Yeah. And this is one thing, if you can just look at what your kids are eating, look in the labels and look for if it says monosodium glutamate, but don't only look for that. You're going to need to go and do a web search of pseudonyms for monosodium glutamate because these companies are aware that we're aware now. So they hide it, and they'll hide it under the other names like textured protein, hydrolyzed protein, natural flavorings, artificial flavorings, yeast extract. There's all these different things that are actually MSG that's hidden. And what MSG is, it's what's called in Dr. Russell Blaylock's book, Excitotoxins, The Taste That Kills.
Great book.
He really documents this quite well so you can understand it better. And he talks about how this can just trigger neurons to fire until they fatigue and die. Now, this is what tricks our brains into thinking that food tastes good. So a lot of kids love these things. That's why if you look at Flamin' Hot Cheetos, for example, it's one of the first ingredients. And what happens is that gets into the brain and it stimulates these neurons to fire excessively. So I have these patients that were working for this one company called Golden State Foods. And Golden State Foods makes the sauces for different companies. Let's say they make them for McDonald's. And this particular story was shared with me by all these workers who were coming in. They came in and they said, "Oh my God, I hate this time of year. This is the McRib time of year." I said, "Well, why do you guys hate it?" They said, "Oh, it's because we make this sauce and it gives us all headaches." So, "Well, why does it give you headaches?" He said, "Well, we have to leave the area where we're making the sauces and these workers come in full hazmat gear, head to toe, NIOSH respirators, and they're carrying in the big bags of MSG and they're pouring them into the vat." And I asked him, I said, "Well, why are they in full hazmat gear?" He said, "Oh, because if they get it on their skin or they breathe it in these larger amounts, they can actually have a seizure." And so that's why they have to be protected this way. So he said, they pour the stuff in. I said, "Okay, they pour it in, and then what happens?" He said, "Well, the stuff starts circulating, and now we're sent back in to do the work. And so now all this MSG is getting aerosolized. And as they're breathing it in," he says, "all these people start to get things like headaches or like little twitches or different neurological issues." All these patients were in my office getting treatment for what was going on by being exposed to this aerosolized version of MSG. So on a smaller scale, when your kids are eating this, you're getting the same thing. It's getting into the brain. It's stimulating these neurons to fire, and it can lead these neurons to actually die at an earlier rate. You'll have the MSG companies who will claim it doesn't do anything, but even in the medical journal Neuron, they talk about the effects that glutamate has on the brain, in particular with a concussion, because you get an impact. One of the first things that happens is whatever excessive glutamate you have in the brain, it gets released. And as it gets released, that sets up the potential for extra damage in the brain as well. So that's why it's so important. If there's nothing else you get out of this, go home and start reading what your kids are eating and see if there's MSG in there. And particularly if your kids are into working out and taking protein shakes or meal replacement bars, etc. Like I used to do this a lot when I did a lot of bodybuilding. A lot of times MSG is in there. And then also they'll put a lot of artificial sweeteners like aspartame, like sucralose. And those things can also have problems as well and can disrupt, blood sugar systems within the body. And that makes these kids more vulnerable.
Oh my goodness. It's always interesting to hear the background stories of the people who work with this stuff, right? I think the idea of even just like an MSG headache, it's understood, right? That some people have these reactions, but I think what's less understood is that we're all having reactions to MSG. Just for some of us, it's a big deal and we're in bed with a headache or something.
Exactly.
But for all of us, it's an excitatory response in the brain. And an excitatory response in the brain can look like all kinds of things, from mood and behavior. And
insomnia.
Yeah, hyperactivity, insomnia, all of these things can be excessive glutamate. Yeah. I get asked sometimes about creatine. Is that part of this?
Yeah, I haven't seen any problems with this in the research, and I've used creatine in the past as well. Creatine gets a bad rap because you'll see some doctors kind of mistakenly say, oh, it triggers kidney damage. That's not accurate. It's accurate if the person has an underlying kidney disorder or disease, that it can be problematic. And one of the problems is that if you're taking supplemental creatine, you can't use the blood test anymore to really tell if you have excessive creatine, because you're going to get it elevated on the blood test from taking it. But with a healthy individual, I haven't seen any studies showing creatine being problematic for either the kidneys or for the brain. I'm much more concerned with their protein shakes that have MSG that are in there because of the flavor enhancement, or their protein bars that they're taking. That's where there's a bigger source of it, of creating a problem there.
Okay, so really good practical tip for parents. If your child athlete wants to take nutritional supplements of any kind, just take a very close look at the quality and the additives.
Exactly. And potentially one of the most popular types of protein is whey protein. And I know when I used to do a lot of bodybuilding, that's what I was using a lot. What people don't realize is that for a lot of people is going to be an inflammatory. It can trigger autoimmunity, or if you have autoimmunity, it can ramp it up. And we look at the rates of people who react to whey or to casein or other kinds of cow-based proteins. That can be problematic potentially, because that can either trigger leaky gut, or it can aggravate it, and it can also trigger then leaky brain. And so these are things where if you've got a history in your family, say Hashimoto's particularly, or diabetes, these are ones where when you're looking at your kids, I would definitely recommend not doing a whey-based protein and doing more of a plant-based protein. And again, I was the biggest milk drinker, whey protein advocate on the planet. But then as I went through my functional medicine courses, I saw the data that's being shared. If you're not sure about it, one thing you can do is do some food reaction tests like cyrexlabs.com. They have some good tests that you can do on there to see what foods your kid might react to. Do they react to gluten cross reactors, to corn, to soy, to any of these things? Because those can also be factors that can lead them to being more susceptible to a concussion, or also having the long-term effects of it.
I think that is often misunderstood as well. These tests that Dr. Gair is talking about is to see whether dairy is causing an inflammatory response in the body, right? And we've done a couple other shows on food allergies and food sensitivities and how to interpret them correctly. I guess the main point is that you want to keep inflammation down, and you want to keep the body's inflammatory response appropriate. And if you're pounding back the dairy and the dairy is causing an inflammatory response, you want to know that.
Exactly.
Right? You want to know that. And that's what these tests can be helpful for.
Yeah. And the problem with it is some people think, oh, well, I eat gluten or dairy and I don't have any gut reactions. Well, especially Dr. Karazian talks about how majority of the reactions from gluten are neurological, not even gut-based whatsoever. That's what it is for my wife. She gets no gut issues. I get gut issues. Hers are all neuro. And we see this with a lot of kids too, that it's a neuro issue. And I'm sure you saw it as a teacher. I saw it as a teacher when I was teaching junior high. The kids would come in the first hour and they'd be fairly normal. And then we had what was called nutrition break. And for nutrition break, they gave the kids either milk or Sunny Delight plus cookies. So guess how they were when they came back into my class? They were bouncing off the walls from the sugar, the gluten, and the dairy.
And more kids than we realize are having these responses. So what do you have to say about energy drinks? Because those are also a big issue with athletes. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't like them. I used to do these things. I used to be hooked on caffeine. I would drink probably about a pot of coffee a day, and I would go to Starbucks and get the venti coffee black. That's how addicted I was to it. It starts to disrupt everything. You've got a ton of sugar, you've got a ton of caffeine, and then you've got a lot of times there's other types of stimulants that are put in there as well too. I know here in the United States, we've had some kids die from some of these energy drinks, end up in the hospital with seizures. And I know I once, back in my 20s, when I was taking something called Rip Fuel, I took a bunch of those things and I thought I was going to have a stroke. My heart rate, I couldn't calm it down. So that's one of the downsides. And the kids aren't just having just one of them. They're having multiple. They're not a replacement for a healthy diet. And I have so many athletes who will come in and they'll ask me, hey, doc, what can I do to enhance my play, to have more energy and to put on more muscle mass? Like, what's a good supplement? What's a good shake or a good bar to do? And I'll ask them, well, what'd you eat for breakfast? Oh, I don't have breakfast. Well, what do you have for lunch? Oh, I'll just have like a rock star and have some chips. Okay, what do you have after you go to practice? Oh, I'll go to 7-Eleven and get some nachos and I'll get a big gulp. There's this disconnect with the nutritional side of it. So I'd say with these ones who are trying to do the energy drinks, you're doing a short-term benefit that's going to have a long-term cost. If you go and you straighten out the diet, you're not going to have those types of issues. Like for myself, a recovering addict to these kinds of energy drinks and protein drinks, I don't even do caffeine really anymore. And I don't need as much sleep as I used to. I used to sleep 10 or 12 hours a day and I was constantly jacking myself up with these drinks. And now I usually wake up before my alarm goes off. So I'm not a fan of them because of that. And then a lot of times they have MSG and artificial sweeteners in them too.
Yeah, real fuel is what they need. I want to ask you what we should be eating, what we should be feeding our kid athletes. But before we get into that, can you just explain, because you've said it a few times and I'm not sure everybody understands, the connection between leaky gut and leaky brain
Sure.
and why this matters so much.
Yeah, and it's what we call a bidirectional pathway. So it can start here or start here, and one's going to affect the other because there's what's called crosstalk, where they're constantly talking to each other back and forth. So let's start with the leaky gut portion of it. So let's say you go out and you feed your kids some standard non-organic wheat. Well, that wheat has been treated with glyphosate. Monsanto will say it doesn't cause any problems, but go on to PubMed, look at the research studies. You can see that usually within about 15 or 20 minutes of ingesting something with glyphosate on it, it starts to break down the gut barrier. That can now be disrupted for years. It can take a while to heal it. A lot of your neurotransmitters are made in the gut. And so now you're going to affect how that's talking to the brain, and you can start to get a leaky brain. And what that means is that materials that normally shouldn't get into the bloodstream or get into the brain, they now have an opening and they can get in there when they shouldn't. And that can now trigger problems to occur. So let's say we get the concussion. Dr. Karazian says within about 20 minutes or so, you can start to get leaky gut as well. As you got this leaky brain, now if you're eating the MSG and these other things, more of it can get in there. It can cross more easily into that blood-brain barrier. And if you are reactive to gluten or to dairy or whatever, or let's say you are eating foods with MSG, et cetera, it's going to get more into the bloodstream and can create more of these long-term problems. We also know that leaky gut can be the thing that starts autoimmunity. So if we look at autoimmunity, it's exploding. I know I have many times multiple generations of families that'll come in, and the grandparents, the 90-year-old grandparents, are always the healthiest, especially if they came from a third world country where they were eating food right where they were, drinking out of a local stream. They're literally the healthiest. The sickest ones are the kids. The kids come in and I see they've got the most, when we run tests to see how many antibodies they have for autoimmunity, they've got the most of them. They already have leaky gut in an early age. It just has this devastating effect on all aspects of their body. And so your food can do it, traumas can do it, et cetera. Infections can do it as well.
Yeah, important point. I think it's just important for people to know, like after a head trauma, you might see more sensitivities to foods. You might see weird skin reactions that never happened before, interesting things that you wouldn't necessarily connect. And what I hear you saying is that all of those things are connected. I mean, this is the beauty of something like functional medicine, right? Which considers the body as a whole. And what happens to the brain doesn't stay in the brain. It affects the entire nervous system.
It does. Yeah. And I see this a lot. Like I'm in different groups. I'm in like functional medicine doctors groups and functional neurology doctors groups. And a lot of times you get the neuro side only looks at the neuro, and the functional medicine side sometimes only looks at the gut. And I'm like, guys, it's like peanut butter and chocolate. This is a Reese's peanut butter cup. Combine the two. Because, if you look at the studies, you get leaky gut. Now they can turn on SIBO because then your valves don't function right. And I see these doctors and patients talking about what's something can I do for this, for SIBO, et cetera. It's like, have you looked at the brain? If you listen to your gut with auscultation, do you hear bowel sounds or do you not hear bowel sounds? One thing that your listeners can do is there's simple tests you can do to see what your brain function is going on. Like, can you swallow well? Can your kids swallow well? And particularly at the end of the day, if they can't swallow well, then a lot of times their vagus nerve is not firing properly. And that's a warning sign that there's problems going on in the brain. They can also do a simple thing at home called the peanut butter sniff test, which is where they'll cover one nostril and you get a ruler and you should be able to smell it from 12 inches away. And you test it on each side. And if you've got to get closer than 12 inches, you've got some different neuroinflammation going on there. And that can also be impacting your gut as well. So there's a couple little tests that patients can do at home. And then if they want to do something therapeutically too, in addition to nutrition, they can do things like a gargling exercise where they take a cup of water and gargle hard for a minute on a daily basis. And that'll stimulate the vagus nerve. So you get this crosstalk between the brain and the gut. You can start to try to heal some of those things, because these concussions too can also turn on Hashimoto's as well as other types of autoimmunities. So you got to look at these warning signs in your kids. If your kid gets a concussion and now all of a sudden they're really tired, they're lethargic, they put on weight, they're starting to bloat, you need to consider what's going on with the brain and the gut, how they're impacting one another.
So I'm going to go wrap my kids in bubble wrap right now. Yeah. Because my gosh, like any blow to the head, right? It's a question that I ask the families who come and see me. Usually they come later and their kids are struggling in school and those sorts of things. And I ask them, was there ever a head trauma? And sometimes they're like, actually, when they were 2, they had a nasty whack on the head, and you just don't think to connect the two. So, okay, let's tackle like, what can we do? Because I'm not going to obviously wrap my 3 boys in bubble wrap, but I also want to like feel okay with sending them out on the hockey rink. So what should we be feeding our kids, and especially our athlete kids? I shouldn't even say that. All of our kids.
all the kids, but particularly athletes, and particularly depending on what sport. If you got a female soccer player, a female basketball player, those are number 1 and number 2 for concussions.
I was shocked to read that. I was shocked to read that.
Hmm.
Number 1 and number 2, female
Yeah.
soccer and female basketball.
Female basketball. I was shocked when I read that study on it too, because I was a football player. I thought we were the biggest ones, but soccer, it's the heading. And the heading does it so much that here where I'm in California, they've banned it in kids under a certain age because it's such a trigger for it. When we look at girls, theoretically, one of the reasons is the longer, more slender neck, just you can get more of a whipping that occurs. And then plus, as you're going through puberty and you get these hormonal surges, those hormonal surges can make you more vulnerable to a concussion as well.
So can I just clarify
Yeah.
that for a second? Does that mean that they're getting more concussions, or does that mean that they're suffering more because of their concussions?
Interesting question. So what I've seen, at least in that study, it didn't say if they're suffering more. It was talking more about rates. Now, it did talk about duration. So it did show that there was, in general, longer duration for female athletes compared to the male athletes. It did show that the females tend to take longer because of the hormonal surges being one of the theoretical issues there. Didn't really go into an explanation. So what I'm giving you is kind of my theory on it and things that I've piecemealed from my functional medicine courses.
Interesting. I bet we'll get more research on that in the next 10 years, to, to come out.
Exactly. And, they don't even talk about, say, people who are doing MMA,
Right.
doing boxing, cheerleading, et cetera, flyers getting thrown up in the air and getting dropped. So it's just, you can get impacts in any type of a sport, just about.
Right. What can we do to think preventatively?
Let's make it simple, because sometimes people get overwhelmed with too many details. So first off, if your budget allows it, eat organic if you can, because then you're going to not be exposed to some of the chemical pesticides, et cetera, that can break down the gut. If you can't, make sure you get a good veggie wash and soak those vegetables beforehand. So that way you're trying to minimize that type of contact with those kind of chemicals. Same thing with your meats that you're going to eat, whether chicken, beef, whatever. Try to get those organic, pasture raised, et cetera. So you got a healthier animal. So they're going to pass over a healthier tissue to you as well when you're eating them. So that's a good starting point. I like to tell people, try to get as many servings of vegetables in as a day. When we say vegetables and fruits, what do people hear? They hear fruit. And so they eat a ton of fruit and hardly any vegetables. So I really say get as many vegetables in as you can and try to get as many different colors as you can. And real colors, not artificial. Different colors signify different types of nutrients and different kinds of vitamins that are in there. Try to make it like a rainbow of colors. And then also think about good fats, like the oils that you cook with. Don't use canola oil. Don't use corn. Don't use sunflower, safflower oil. Go for things like olive oil, like avocado oil, like coconut oil. Coconut oil gets demonized a lot, but there's, especially for a brain injury, there's really good fats that are in there. So I like to have people using those on a regular basis, trying to get a foundation of good, healthy fats. If you want to use some different kinds of nuts, like walnuts that have a lot of good omegas in them, if you can get some wild Pacific types of fish out there. I can't stand fish, but I still recommend it because it's good. So I supplement with fish oils to make up for that. If you can get good wild fish, that's a good one. Stay away from the farm stuff because it doesn't have the same kind of fats. You miss out on the benefits on there. Those are a few pillars, a few cornerstones. And make sure, like, if you're hangry, you got to do things like eating every 2 or 3 hours until you stabilize that, because you don't want to let those blood sugar crashes happen. So those are just a few basic, simple things you can do. Avoid the processed foods and the processed sugars. It's a fairly simple thing. Avoid eating out as much as you can. For your kids, don't give them the sugary drinks. Have them drink water. Do you know how many patients I have come in who don't drink any water at all? And just getting them to drink water on a daily basis completely changes their health, especially their brain health. A lot of these kids are walking around dehydrated, and that's bad for the brain, bad for the heart, bad for the kidneys, etc.
Then they're given a Gatorade because they're dehydrated.
Yes. Oh my God. Or Pedialyte. And have you ever looked at the ingredients on Pedialyte? It's high fructose corn syrup. That's like the worst thing you can give to people, especially a sick person or an injured person. So definitely stay away from those types of things. And if that's what your doctor is recommending to you for your concussion or for the nutrition for your kids, you need to find somebody else who knows about nutrition, because clearly that doctor or nutritionist does not know what the current research is. We were trained in these things that way 20, 30 years ago. I used to recommend artificial sweeteners 25 years ago, because I didn't know any better. We didn't see the research on it. So I say stay away from those things. Eat as natural as possible, many different colors, get as wide a variety of vegetables as you can. If you're going to eat fruits, go for the lower sugar options like the berries, different colors, blueberries, raspberries, etc. Stay away from some of the higher sugar ones. That's a basic cornerstone you can do with your foods.
What I love about what you just said is that it's the same as what all people need.
Exactly. It's no different.
Adults,
It's no
kids,
different.
healthy, unhealthy, recovery. Like, it's no different.
It's not.
We need a diet that is full of color and real foods and no junk. So
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be complicated.
It doesn't.
Obviously, getting the stuff into your kids can feel complicated.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on getting this into kids who might be resistant or might not understand why they need this?
Yeah. And I think you got to find what motivates the kid and
Yeah.
come out of that direction, because that's what will get them to stick to it when you're not around. Because if you just do it with the stick, then as soon as they're off with their friends, they're going to go and chat on the pizza or the other things. I ate horribly as a teenager, or even in college when I was playing college football. We all ate horrible. We would work out for 2 hours, and then my teammates and I would go to, say, McDonald's, and I would literally get 2 Big Macs and 2 cheeseburgers, 2 orders of fries, a large Diet Coke, a chocolate shake, and an order of chicken McNuggets. That's what we would do, because we didn't understand the connection. The thing is getting your kids to understand the connection with what they're motivated for. So a lot of these youth athletes are motivated to try to get to college, to get a scholarship, or to try to be the best at their sport. So if you've got an athlete that's motivated that way, that's where I'll tell them, hey, do you want to play better? Do you want to have more endurance? Do you want to get injured less? And if you do get injured, recover faster? Well, if you do, follow this. And that's what I tell my athletes. I actually give them a handout the first day in my office, this diet for injury, which is literally the same one as my diet for concussion almost. It's just you package it different for whatever it is. And I tell them, hey, if you want to have to see me less, you follow these guidelines. If you want to see me more and spend more time on the sidelines injured, don't follow them. Eat everything you're already eating. And then that's when the kids are like, oh, shoot, I didn't know there was a connection there. I'm like, if I knew when I was a college football player what I know now, my God, I think of how much better I would play. And that's what can motivate. It's really funny because with this approach, I have parents now telling me, my kid is like the food police. Like if I want to eat something, they'll say, well, Dr. Gair said if you do this, it's going to cause this or that. And that's the key thing, is if you can get the kids to understand what it does. Or let's say you got a kid and some kids need more stuff. Like they might need food reaction testing. Like for myself, I tested myself to see what I reacted to. I reacted badly to gluten, and my particular reaction will cause a breakdown of the gut that can increase my colon cancer risk by about 5 or 10%. To me, that's bad enough to stop. So now anytime I want a real pizza, I'm like, do I want to increase my colon cancer risk? And do I want to shave a few years off of my lifespan for this piece of pizza? I'm like, no, I don't. So I don't eat it. So that's the key thing. Find what motivates them and present it in that manner.
Yeah. And I love what you just said is like, you've got the same handout for the concussion as the sports performance. And you guys listening, like that can go for absolutely anything. The same thing for skin, for better eyesight, for better growth, for, anything that your child desires will benefit from a diet like Dr. Gair just talked about.
A longer life, more energy, pretty much. Yeah. It's the same stuff.
That makes it nice and simple for us parents.
It does. And there's so many books that are written, and all these people make it so complicated. And it's kind of like that Occam's razor kind of thing, is that the simplest solution is usually the most accurate or the most correct one. And the simplest solution is just eat real food, eat real, clean, organic food if you can.
Yeah. And also, I think it's important to say that some extra nourishment for the brain, like the things that you mentioned, right? Extra fats, extra magnesium, extra anti-inflammatories can really help in recovery.
And then you're going to have some people who need a lot more stuff. But I start with the simplest stuff, and I tell people, hey, let's try this for 30 days, see where you are. If you're not far enough, then we'll take it further and we'll do some food reaction testing. We'll do other things. So that way, everybody's not spending $1 million right off the bat. Because for many people, it's going to start with, I'm going to give you this diet anyway, regardless of what your food reaction test says. I'm going to have you eliminate gluten, casein, corn, and soy, regardless of what your test says anyway.
Because they have the highest capacity to stimulate inflammation. And our main job here is to bring down inflammation. So let's do this. And then if you don't get where you want to get, then you can look for other sources of inflammation that you maybe hadn't considered. So I love the approach. Okay, last question. I got to ask you about the lasers, because you are getting such incredible results from these laser therapies. And I think every parent should know that it's out there.
As you can see. Yeah, I've got a laser on my brain right now, but for those of you who see it, this is one of my lasers. This is a handheld laser. So key thing here is if you're looking at using lasers for brain support, don't go to someone who has a thermal laser, because there are high-powered lasers that are thermal lasers, and those are contraindicated in the brain. This is a low-powered laser. This is what's called a class 2 laser. So there are different classes of lasers. This one from Erconia, these currently in the United States at least, are the only ones that are cleared by our FDA to be used on the head for dampening inflammation. So that's one of the main things that the laser does is we get it on the brain, it dampens inflammation, but it does so much more than that. This is where it really helped me with my history of ADHD and Tourette's and whatnot, is we have the laser on here. One of the things it's going to do is it's going to also stimulate brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's like fertilizer for the brain. And you can now stimulate the brain to make new neuronal connections and improve the synaptic connections. And that's really what our brain runs off of. The more connections you have, the more efficient your brain is. And laser's been shown in numerous studies going back to the 1960s and 70s even to be able to have this impact on the brain to help it to recover. It's been shown in a lot of recent research studies to be able to even to reverse neurodegeneration by stimulating the breakdown of these protein misfoldings like amyloid beta and tau protein misfoldings that you see in things like Alzheimer's and dementia. So you get this even on a kid, and now you're having this long-term impact for their brain health. The laser will also increase energy levels of a molecule called ATP, which is your basic energy level, that will improve overall brain function because you've got more of that molecule going through the brain. You're also going to dampen inflammation. You're going to stimulate the production of something called glutathione, which is a really wonderful antioxidant. With lasers, you can produce a ton of this. It stimulates your body to produce it, and also to produce something called nitric oxide that helps to dilate blood vessels and improve blood flow. And one of the big things, you're going to stimulate stem cells. When I get the laser on the head, the energy from these low-level lasers, these class 2 lasers, will actually stimulate more stem cell production and immune cell production. Then these stem cells will migrate through these canals that were discovered in 2018 by Harvard researchers, and they'll migrate to the surface of the brain to help to heal up the brain and to enhance cognitive performance.
Oh my gosh.
So really, really cool, amazing stuff. We have people who come in who were devastated by a sports injury or a car accident. I had one patient who couldn't do basic math. She couldn't even count backwards from 100 by fives. We'd get the laser on them, and what we do is whatever they're weak at, we have them try to do it while they're under the laser, and you can see them improve while under the laser in real time. And it's really exciting to do.
Wow, that does it all. That does all the things that you want for recovery. This can be used for neurodegeneration and brain, but also I would imagine any kind of healing.
Yeah.
If you're trying to accelerate healing of a break or a sprain or...
Yeah, breaks. We do it all the time with athletes. We usually will heal a break at least 30 to 50% faster. The sprains, same thing, 50 to sometimes 70% faster. This particular laser from Merconia is FDA cleared for pre-op and post-op. They also just completed a big quadruple blind placebo-controlled study on autistic kids and had amazing results that have been submitted to the FDA for review and potential clearance for the treatment of autism. And they did that comparing it to an LED device, because you'll have LED manufacturers will claim that it can do the same thing. So they wanted to see, is this true or not? And they had these kids go through and use an LED or use the laser. And the ones who used the laser had amazing improvements. There was no improvement with the LED group. So then 6 months later, they crossed them over and gave them the laser on the brain, and they had those same improvements like the other kid. One of the first things lasers were doing in the 1960s was with cuts and lacerations and burns. You can also affect the microbiome here. Even though the laser doesn't directly penetrate to the gut, you can stimulate improved microbiome with a laser over the abdomen. The Russians were using it clear back in 1974 over the liver. These lasers were also used in a University of Illinois Medical Center study on patients with chronic kidney fibrosis. And it was shown that violet, green, and also red low-level lasers were actually able to stimulate tissue regeneration for those patients too.
Oh, that is fascinating. And so the bottom line of why they're working is, if I understood correctly, they are reducing the inflammatory response, and at the same time, they're stimulating the compounds that are required for healing.
Yeah, like especially stem cells. That's exactly right. And increasing energy throughout the whole system so the body can run more efficiently.
That is amazing. So what kind of practitioner would use something like this? Where would parents go to find somebody who is doing this kind of work?
So laser therapy is more common right now amongst chiropractors. I know I've trained some doctors up in Canada, also across the US. I also speak Spanish, so I train doctors throughout Latin America and also in Europe. So there's different types of practitioners, but most common in chiropractors. Some physical therapists will do it. I'm starting to see it more in naturopaths utilizing it, and some physical therapists, some acupuncturists as well. What people can do is if they just go to erchonia.com, that's ERCHONIA.com, they can type in their region where they're located, their address, and they can find a practitioner near them who utilizes these types of devices.
That's the company that makes the laser?
Yeah, that's the company that I use. I've used their lasers since 2004. They have the most research behind them. And for those of us in the United States, they have the most what are called FDA clearances. So there's a big difference in these companies of what kind of research they've done, and they've got the most of it.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that's going to be really helpful for a lot of parents. I'll just end with the caveat that it doesn't take the place of the good nutrition and the nutrients and all of that, right?
Oh, no. Yeah, I actually tell my patients when they come in, I said, listen, this laser is fantastic for stimulating stem cells and for dampening inflammation. But if you leave my office and you go and you eat your crappy diet, it's like I'm a fireman, I put out the fire, and you just walked back into your house and sprayed gasoline all over it and started flicking matches everywhere. It can only do so much. I need you to be a part of the team here and to make sure that you're doing what you need to do when you're outside of my office, because we can only do so much with these devices. You have to take responsibility.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And I think also what you said earlier was golden. Attach it to their goal. Like, what is
Exactly.
it that they want? And they might not see the connection between what they want and what you're putting together as a plan. But rest assured, there is a connection. And if you need help figuring out what that connection is, there's people who can help you with that.
And if they're a non-athlete, at least tie it to something they like to do. Like, is it video games? Is it something else they want to do? Hey, all right, I'm going to let you do these video games, but I need you to be on board with eating clean. And I'm a gamer. I love video games. So I even make myself accountable on that. So if you can do that to where, hey, okay, you got to do this kind of nutrition to get this type of reward or a trip or a toy or something like that, that's going to be more of a motivating factor for them.
Yeah, and they might not even be able to tolerate the game if they've had a concussion, right? With just the
Oh,
screen.
yeah. You got to dial that back. We actually do some therapy where we have people do gaming while we laser them at the same time to the point of their tolerance. It's things that we've used to kind of reintegrate visual pathways and whatnot. We're moving into doing some stuff with lasers, with virtual reality for athletes to retrain them with their sport too, to get the brain endurance back up. So there's some exciting stuff that's just coming up. It's just fun to do these things and help a lot of people.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this. Can you just tell people where they can find more information about you and what you're doing?
Sure. My website is laser, and that's with an S, laserchiropractic.net. They can find me there. If they're still on Facebook, I do have a Facebook groups page called Dr. Gair's Patient Health and Performance Secrets, and they're free to join that. And that's where I share a lot of info on there. I also have my Facebook page, which is just Laser Chiropractic on Facebook.
Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and keeping these kids active.
Well, thanks for having me on here and giving me a platform to share this information with a lot of people.
Bye for now, everybody. So